Also add, finally, just as tribute to our very distinguished panel, that two of them I know quite well, having had a chance to work with them, and have a great deal of respect for them in that regard, just having gotten to know them. The other two I know by reputation, and their reputation, Mayor Suarez and Councilwoman Berriozabal, their reputation precedes them and is a very distinguished reputation, so it's a pleasure for me to join them here. So let me get right into it, beginning with our first panelist, Dr. Harry Pachon. Dr. Pachon is the National Director of the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. He is currently serving as the Kennan Professor of Politics at Pitzer College out in Pomona, out in the smog belt outside of Los Angeles, which I know so well. Someone out there from LA. He is a distinguished author of at least two major works on Latino politics in the United States, Hispanics in the United States and Mexican Americans, both of which were published by Prentice Hall. He has been the executive director of NALEO for the last 3 years and has been particularly important in their current drive to increase the citizenship among the Latino population in the United States. It is, from my personal point of view, perhaps the most fundamental issue facing certainly Mexican Americans, getting them to become citizens. Prior to working for NALEO, however, he knows his way around American politics. He served for 4 years as a staff member of the Appropriations Committee to the Congress and was the chief of staff for Congressman Edward R. Roybal of California, who's been on Capitol Hill now, 24 years now? Yeah, okay. He'll be there until I run against him, I think. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. Dr. Harry Pachon.
Thank you, Frank, for such a gracious introduction. It's truly a pleasure to be here and to have been asked to share some thoughts on Hispanic politics in 1988 with so many honored guests and so many distinguished speakers here on the panel. I think, however, before I address the issue of Hispanic politics in '88, it's important to discuss two political myths that surround our community at the present time. Myths are like stereotypes. They belie the complexity of reality. Unfortunately, believing these myths in our community has a political and strategic consequences for the political future, as well as how the general society perceives the Hispanic community. And I think that the first myth that we most often encounter, those of us who are involved in Latino politics, is that Hispanic political power, excuse me, Frank, for saying this, is still at the stage of potential. And we've all heard versions of this. As recently as 3 weeks ago, the New York City Tribune ran its political analysis of the 1988 Hispanic vote under the banner, "Votes of 20 million Hispanics called a sleeping giant." A sleeping giant. Imagine the image this conveys. A community that is about to wake up from its afternoon siesta. And if we look at American politics, that is the image that surrounds the Hispanic community. Yet, the facts present a different picture. There are now over 3,000 elected officials in the United States of Hispanic background, alongside the over 6,000 black elected officials. There are 1.5 as many Hispanic elected officials in California as there are any other minority group. There are 7 times as many Hispanic elected officials in the state of Texas as any minority group. The number of Hispanic elected officials has doubled in the size of a decade. And this doubling is particularly significant because if you look at Hispanic political organizational history, we're really looking at a community that got its basic start with political organizations back in 1968. One of our oldest organizations, LULAC, can trace its history back all the way to 1928. But yet compare the NAACP and the Urban League with founding dates of 1914 and 1912. So we're talking about a community that's recently come into the political picture. In 2 years, between 1984 and 1986, the size of the potential Hispanic electorate grew by 25%. That is 10 times the growth of the electorate as a whole. This growth in electoral power was already demonstrated in the 1986 elections. And based on the actual vote, based on the CPS analysis of who voted in 1986, it took only 10% of the Puerto Rican Latino vote in the state of New York to make a 1-point difference in election. If 10% of the Puerto Rican vote defected from one candidate to another, it would make a 1% difference in that candidate's plurality. In Texas, it was something like 6% of the population in the state of Texas, of the Hispanic population, would make a 1-point difference. a presidential or a statewide candidate in the state of California only has to reach, again, about 6 or 7% to receive that 1 percentage point. Based on figures like this, the myth of the sleeping giant is seen for what it is. That is, that images need to change. Hispanic political power is simply not potential, but it is an emerging reality. Hispanic political gains are real. The Hispanic vote is real. It is no longer necessary to speak of mañana, but what we do with what we have today. Yet we have to be cautious in the Hispanic community, because there's another myth that can trap us who are involved in political activity. This myth, unfortunately, we as Hispanics want to believe. Again, many of you have heard it, and it goes something like this. Given the spectacular growth of the Hispanic community between 1970 and 1980, the Hispanic community grew by like about 62% in those 10 years, there is a hidden electorate out there that is Hispanic. There's a hidden electoral force out there. All we have to do as community organizers or as people involved in the civic arena is to reach that hidden electorate. And this myth is persuasive. 11% of all the adults in New York State are Puerto Rican Hispanic. In New Jersey, this figure is 7.4%. In California, nearly 20% of the adult population of that state is Latino. However, this figure has to be tempered with something else, that 40% of our community in 1980 was below voting age. Even though in 1980, the Hispanic community's average, even in 1988, the Hispanic community's average age has increased, it's now 24 years, consider the implications of being the youngest age group in American society today. Disproportionate numbers of Hispanics are precisely in those age ranges that vote the least, 18 to 24 years. We know this because as a country, we were unable to get voting participation during the 1960s when large numbers of people turned 18. As we know, electoral strategies in the 60s and 70s foundered on this very obstacle. Besides youth, however, there's another obstacle that is present in the Hispanic community. And that factor is invisible and by and large has no counterpart in the black community, the community that the Hispanic community is most often compared to insofar as electoral politics is concerned. This factor is U.S. citizenship. While the media, the national media, tends to look at Hispanics, and I have to say this, so do many academic social scientists look at Hispanic politics, as either being native-born citizens or illegal aliens. And perhaps this is fed by the evening news reports of all the illegal aliens coming across in Tijuana. And I think that all of you have seen the afternoon news clips of them slipping over the fence and the image of the illegal Mexican immigrant or illegal Dominican immigrant. The reality is that there's a third group out there. And this third group is neither native-born nor illegal alien. This group of people number close to 4 million in numbers. 1 out of every 3 adults, Hispanic adults, fits into this category. And that category is legal resident immigrants. In New York, the state closest to us here, insofar as a large Hispanic population, adjacent to or contiguous with every Puerto Rican community, there is a Latin American enclave. In New York City, it's Dominicans in Manhattan, it's Colombians in Queens. In New Jersey, it's Cubans. In Los Angeles, it's Nicaraguans, Salvadorians, and of course, the largest immigrant group of all, Mexican immigrants here in the Southwest. While Puerto Ricans are all U.S. citizens by birth, 40% of the Hispanics in New York State are of other Latin American countries. And that means that 1 out of every 3 Latinos in this country, 1 out of every 3 adult Latinos in this country cannot vote, cannot serve on grand juries, cannot work in the police departments or the federal government. And this large body of non-citizens, legal aliens, and I have to keep on saying that because so often we get too confused, legal aliens versus illegal aliens, explains why 52% of all Hispanics who did not vote in 1986 gave as their reason non-citizenship. In comparison, only 3% of the black population and only 3% of the white Anglo population gave non-citizenship as a reason for not voting. In the presidential elections this November, there will be nearly as many Hispanics who can't vote due to non-citizenship as there will be Hispanic registered voters in the United States. Let's keep this clearly in mind next time we find ourselves being swayed by the myth that our large numbers should automatically and unequivocally be linked to voters going to the polls. Yet the political future is bright. As our community's youth matures, they will become increasingly involved in politics. Every 2 years, for example, in the decade of the 1980s, a cohort of over 200,000 potential new voters enters voting age years. More and more Latin Americans are becoming U.S. citizens. If citizenship drives now at the experimental stage become successful, we will see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Hispanics becoming U.S. citizens over the next 10 years. And there's something curious about naturalized citizens. They tend to vote more, according to the evidence that is available, than their cohorts of the same social economic status. But there are tremendous problems for the Hispanic community in this regard, because there are simply no standalone, off-the-shelf models for U.S. citizenship campaigns. We are just beginning to realize the magnitude of the task ahead for us in the Hispanic community. There are issues to be addressed insofar as citizenship campaigns are concerning. How, for example, do we make the benefits of U.S. citizenship readily transmittable to immigrants who are already working legally here in the States and have no real idea of the real benefits that they gain by becoming citizens, especially since there are no models present throughout the nation? How do we overcome the perceived and sometimes very real fear of the federal agency in charge of naturalization, the INS? How do we overcome the abuses that are made by anonymous INS bureaucrats who have the nerve to ask such questions? And I've been looking forward to addressing these questions to you because of Harvard and its great reputation in the student body. Let me ask you 3 questions that we've heard in abuses insofar as the INS citizenship exam is concerned, and see how many of you could answer if each of these 3 questions, or all 3 of these questions. How many pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock? What is the governor of California's wife's first name? What is Governor Cuomo's wife's first name? And finally, and perhaps the most absurd of all, who won the 1966 World Series? And usually in the audience we have somebody who can answer them. The citizenship exam, ladies and gentlemen, is the closest equivalent we have to the literacy test of yesteryear. Every year, over 140,000 citizenship applicants are rejected. And the sad thing about it is that we do not know for what reason or for what country they are from. Are, for example, Mexican and Dominican immigrants rejected at higher rates than Irish and Italian immigrants? We don't know now, but we will know in the next 6 months if a Senate-sponsored amendment that we've worked on has some effect. For the present, though, however, we have to combat blind acceptance to myths that simplistically portray the Hispanic community. Instead, we have to consider the implications that the political gains that the Latino community has made in the past 10 years has come about when 50% of the Hispanic population in this country has not been enfranchised to vote. From this perspective, we see that the Hispanic community has done much in the political arena. Much more obviously remains to be done. In 1988, the last presidential election of this decade, perhaps we can take this forum to objectively analyze the Latino community's impact on the national election. If it's a close election, in my opinion, then Latinos are going to have the capability of truly being the swing vote. Based on the statistics that I gave you earlier, based on 1986 and 1984 census data, we see that in California, if it's a close election, and I guess the only model we have recently for a close election would be the 1976 election between I'm blanking out here. Between 1970s, between Carter and Jerry Ford, we see that in California there was a 1.7% difference, and in Texas there was a 3.1% difference in the vote. All it would take in the Hispanic community to impact on these numbers, in California would be something like 10% of the Hispanic population voting one way to actually have an impact on that election. And in Texas, it would take about 11% of the vote, based on some extrapolations from the 1976. This is speculation, however, and what we do know is that in 1984, according to the different polls, and taken by my colleague up here on the panel, we do know that the Hispanics constituted something like 12 to 16% of the Democratic vote in California. 12 to 16%. They constituted 4 to 6% of the Hispanic vote, of the Republican vote in California. In Texas, 23 to 27% of the Democratic vote was attributable to the Hispanic population. Now, in that election, in 1984, it didn't make a difference. As we know, Ronald Reagan swept California by over 16% and Texas by over 27%. Yet, if it's a close election, it might be a different story. How will the presidential candidates address these issues? Like you, I'm looking forward to see how my fellow panelists address this particular topic. I would say that after a couple of years of observing presidential elections, too often presidential candidates engage in fiesta politics, where they wear hats, eat a burrito, and wear a serape and go into the community. Will they, for example, address the substantive public policy issue that the Hispanic community faces? What are these issues? We know that when we poll Hispanic elected officials, we get such topics as access to higher education, high school dropout rates, drug abuse. Domestic issues are paramount, and they cross-cut Cuban American, Mexican American, and Puerto Rican elected officials. In 1988, we're going to have a chance. A week from now on Super Tuesday, we're going to see if it's fiesta politics as usual, or if there's other public policy issues that are being made relevant to the Hispanic community by the presidential candidates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. Very good for a start on the presentations. The answers to your question, by the way, are Mrs. Dugmatian, the Baltimore Orioles, and more than the Indians wanted. I remember that 66 series because Koufax really let me down, but anyway, that's another story. Our next panelist is another old friend, Mr. Willie Velasquez, the executive director and the founder of the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project. If journalists are skeptics, and even cynics I will concede sometimes, they do tend to respect people that get things done, as opposed to people that talk a lot. You know, you cover people that talk a lot. You cover enough press conferences and you hear things go in one ear and out the other real fast. But you come to respect people who can accomplish things and get things done, and this man certainly has. He's run over 960, probably getting towards 1,000 now, voter registration campaigns in 132 different American cities, as well as American Indian reservations in 6 southwestern states in the years that the Southwest Voter Registration Project has been operating as a nonprofit foundation. He's had a remarkable effect in Texas, even in California, as resistant as it can be to political change sometimes. I will always remember one of the great compliments I think ever paid to Willie was when a national news magazine did a story about him and his early work in Texas. I quoted this once in a column I wrote about him for the LA Times. Said that in Texas he's the one Latino that the Anglo establishment hates to see coming into town. I suspect it's still that way. He does his organization has since gone beyond voter registration to do some remarkably good research that Harry quoted. I quote it regularly on Latino voting patterns in the United States, so I'm sure he will have something stimulating to say, as he usually does. Mr. Willie Velasquez.
Thank you, Frank. I think a good way to begin this is to talk about a report the Census Bureau did that was quite large, larger than most on politics. It was on registration and turnout in the United States from 1972 to 1974. And it sort of answered an interesting question, at least for me anyway. The interesting question was, during this period of time, who was the fastest growing in registration and who didn't register to vote in this country? What group of people registered and what group didn't? I think that were we to be in San Antonio last Sunday, we were training 15 towns. We had about 75 people, the leaders from these towns, because we're beginning the registration drives for the May city council elections in Texas. And almost all of them, I think, felt that the ones that weren't registering the least, the ones that weren't participating in the American electoral process, the ones that didn't were the Mexicans. Then I would ask the question, well, why is it that Mexicans don't register to vote? So then some people will say, well, it's because of education. They'll even quote some of the stuff from across the tracks that Rubel did. And when I was going to college, that was one of the texts that we used. And Rubel would say, there's about 3 or 4 good reasons. One, they're an atomized society. They don't work together. So they can't have a registration drive. 2, they come from a country that doesn't have a long history that's profound in terms of strong Democratic. 3, he says, after all, they're a combination of Spaniards and Indians. What do you expect from those kind? Finally, he posited that it may be that Mexicans may be the first race to never integrate themselves into the American democratic process. Around that mouthful of stuff that Rubel said, many other things come out. That we don't care, that we don't like it, it's too complicated, and all this sort of stuff. Then I say, well, the Census Bureau said that Mexicans were the fastest growing registration in the United States. Well, then that means that, well, actually we aren't that atomistic. We work together quite well. And you combine a Mexican, a Spaniard, and an Indian, and everything turns the other way around, see? When actually we're now the fastest growing. That gets people to thinking. Well, then how is it that Mexicans are now the fastest growing when for 100 and some odd years, at least since 1848, they didn't register and vote in this country? Well, I say that Mexicans always wanted to register and vote. They always wanted to participate. They were ashamed when they didn't register and vote. And they felt bad about it. But I'm going to tell you something. Put yourself in the position of a typical rural South Texas county. Medina County. 42% Mexicano. Adjacent to San Antonio. So it's not so isolated. If you think it's close to San Antonio anyway. Medina County. The Mexicans there had never won an election. Why? Well, because we don't register and we don't vote and we don't cooperate and we don't work well together and all that. Maybe true. Maybe true. But I'd like to point out something. That county had not redistricted since 1896. It had a whole tradition of where Mexicans ought to live, where blacks ought to live, and they drew the lines, and you weren't supposed to change, you weren't supposed to move, and no Mexican had ever won. Ever. Now put yourself in the shoes of those people living there. We started working there intensively in 1980, although we had worked there before. But think about it. Since 1896 to 1980, 84 years in a row, never winning an election. If you're a Mexican, you're going to get depressed about the political process. If you, for 84 years in a row, you lose, right? And you're 42% of the population. And then you say, why? Because we can't work together. Because we don't, because we're atomized. Because all that stuff. All right. The problem was not that the Mexicans didn't want to register and vote. The problem was that there was outrageous gerrymandering. They couldn't win. You had the at-large election scheme. You had racial malapportionment, racial gerrymandering, malapportionment, series of lawsuits. And the last one was settled last week. School board, city council, county commission. First election after all these lawsuits, the Mexicans won. Well, who cares really if you're only talking about one county? But ladies and gentlemen, the first 66 counties in a row that we looked at throughout the Southwest were all gerrymandered against Mexicans. We didn't find one county gerrymandered for Mexicans. See? 66-0 is beyond the range of statistical probability. It doesn't happen that you lose, right? There's something going on. Well, you fix the election system. You make it conform to the American Constitution, and you see a remarkable change. You see what I think has happened many times before in this country. When an immigrant group comes in and starts... So you say, well, that's very persuasive, but let me, I'm still a little skeptical. I'm sort of paraphrasing here, Frank. From 72 to 76, Mexicans actually went backwards in gross numbers registered to vote. From 76 to 80, we were the leaders in the rest of the country. 20%, and I think the rest of the 20% increase in registration from a low base, but the rest of the country grew something like 9%. Something like that. Then from 80 to 84, we grew 27%. And the rest of the country 11. I think from 84 to 88, it'll continue. As a matter of fact, it'll probably continue for a generation. For a generation. What you're really seeing here is the entrance of a large group of people who for many years did not participate in the electoral process, entering into the... What you are seeing here is a transition of a very large group of people. The Census Bureau latest update says 18,097,000. It's a lot. these people are entering into the American political process. You're seeing a transition from powerlessness to power. So there, that settles your, right? Because now the whole discussion's got to change. Now the whole discussion's got to change. I think that's an old discussion. Now we got to talk about the new discussion. And the new discussion is what's going to be our contribution. What's going to be the difference between having a Mexican in there who doesn't get anything done and having an Anglo who doesn't get anything done? Huh? There's no difference. Right? Why get involved? Why sue? Why do all of this stuff if nothing happens? The idea then, I feel, is that we ought to look a little bit at this transition. We ought to continue the suits. I think that they're crucial. We're now up to 86 lawsuits. We've won 85. We're in court on appeal on the 86, and I think we're going to win that one. That's got to continue. The registration drives got to continue. The studies got to continue. But now we have got to think, what is this really for Mexicanos? We got to sit down and say, what is this really all about? Is it getting more Mexicanos? You know, it's the numbers, just in the Southwest. 1974, 1,566 elected. I'm just talking about 5 southwestern states. We hand counted them all. There was a guy by the name of Moreno in California who's not a Mexican, and there was a guy by the name of Dutchover in West Texas who's a Mexican. So we had to count these things very carefully. But in 1974, 1,566 elected officials, 84, 2,861. An increase of 82%. Well, the point then is, what is it that we're going to contribute? I think that that's the question now that Mexicans make. And I go back to the time when Mexicans once were great. I go back to the time when 1521, 1519, when an indigenous people here did do something. And if you look at the chronicles, you will see that they put a lot of emphasis on education. They put a lot of emphasis on justice, and they put a lot of emphasis on high standards for the people that they appointed to run their tribal government in Mexico, Tenochtitlan. Well, I feel very strong that that's what the Mexican electorate is now demanding. I think that the Mexican electorate is going to say the following, that all right, it's brilliant, terrific that we got 2,861 elected officials, but I know a few that we ought to get rid of. And we ought to say, you know what? We don't need 2 or 3 more. I mean, it's not crucial. What we got to do is get rid of those that aren't measuring up to the highest standards. And we got to be firm about that, because what's going to be the Mexican contribution has got to be high standards. When you ask people, when you ask the Mexican electorate about the school problem, you know, you were talking about the issues. 100,000 people, I guess, we polled. And we'll do another many bunch in the next couple of years. The electorate is saying, we want jobs, and we want schools. But it's insightful to look at the follow-up questions and to have the focus group discussions on this question of schools. The Mexican is saying the schools aren't teaching. If the kids aren't learning. The schools aren't teaching, the kids aren't learning. If the student doesn't learn, he ought to be flunked. And if the teacher doesn't teach, he ought to be fired. I think that we now have to start thinking about that kind of thinking among the Mexican electorate. As a matter of fact, I feel that the measure of our success is going to be how diligent we are about paying attention to the voter, who I feel very strongly wants high standards. I don't think it's a question then so much of continuing what we've done in the past. I think that is going to go on. I think the question now is, how do we answer this question? What's the proper exercise of political power? What is it that we Mexicans are going to contribute? And I think the answer is going to be around standards. And those politicians, I think, that really understand this question and really laid out in a way that's easily understood by the electorate, I think are going to be the ones that are going to lead us into that time of power, the time when we really actually do have political power. So in a way, I agree with you and I disagree with you. I agree that we don't really have power. We're transitioning, but it's clear that there is something there. Thank you.
Anything you say, Willie. Our next panelist is a member of the San Antonio, Texas City Council, one of my favorite cities, one of my 2 or 3 favorite in the whole of this wonderful country of ours. Councilwoman Maria Berriozábal has big shoes to fill in her seat. She was explaining to me earlier that the seat she now holds, covering downtown San Antonio and part of the west side, was that once, the previous person who held that seat is now the mayor of San Antonio, Henry Cisneros. She is currently serving her 4th term as a member of the council. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from the University of Texas at San Antonio. Tell you how long I go back in San Antonio. I remember when that campus wasn't there. That was a while back. You can see the white hair. It's getting there. And I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down inside a lot of people are thinking of her as thinking of someone like her, or perhaps she herself, as a possible successor to Mayor Cisneros when he moves on, as I suspect he will. Councilwoman Maria Berriozábal.
I just asked Willie Velázquez if he voted for me, and he did. Willie Velázquez is my constituent, and so is Henry Cisneros.
How does Henry vote?
He tells me he votes for me. Not always with me, but for me. I'm very honored, Dean and students, faculty, friends of this school. As I sat here and listened to Harry and Frank and Willie, and maybe anticipate the remarks of the mayor of Miami, I thought of the best approach that I could take in talking to you this evening. And I think I'm going to kind of put my little notes aside, because Willie inspired me to say some other things. I don't know how many Mexican-American female elected officials you've ever had here, Dean. I venture to say not very many. And that is, we are a small number. We could have at least 20 more sessions like this with at least one, but not very many numbers. One thing that I like to hear in an introduction of myself, and if it's not there, I talk about it, is the fact that when I got elected to the San Antonio City Council in 1981, I was the first Hispanic, Mexican-American, Latina, Chicana elected to the City Council in a city that is over 250 years old, that was Mexico before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, and there had never been a Mexican-American woman elected to the City Council in a city that is now over 55% Hispanic. And I think that is a great honor. However, my question is always, when I hear it in an introduction, what took so long? So what I would like to address, what I would like to talk to you about is, and I was asked to talk about this, is my feelings and my thoughts about a Mexican-American woman serving an elected office. How proud I am of that public trust because of the people that I represent. Willie was going back hundreds and hundreds of years of the history of Hispanic people in this country. We are a people who has contributed long, who has contributed with dignity, who in World War II, our men were decorated far more than any other group, far beyond our numbers in the population. Our young men died and fought in Vietnam. Our families forged with their sweat and with their hands large parts of this country with their labor. I represent una comunidad de dignidad, a community of dignity, a community of honor. And to have people vote and say, Maria, we vote for you to represent us at that council is a very honorable thing to do. And my question, as we read reports like the one that the Southwest Research Institute just did, announcing that there are more poor Hispanics in the United States now than in the past. When we hear statistics like Harry's, that we don't have the political power and clout that we could have, and Frank stated that too. When we hear from Willie that we have expectations of our public officials, the question that comes to me is, where is the pool of people that we're going to go after to have and groom and nurture and educate the future public policy makers, particularly those in public elective office? Right now, the way things are, they are not going to be coming out of Harvard. We have some, Mayor Suarez, Mayor Cisneros, two at least that I know of, who are serving exemplarily in this country. And I think there's more where those came from. There's more where those came from. I would like to address the pull of women as leaders, because that's what I'm an authority on, because that's what I am. There are right now hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women, hispanas. There's some in the audience. We all come from la misma mata, we call it. We come from the same plant, this community of dignity, with women. Mexican American women have been leaders in their community from the time of Cortés, Mexican women in their society after the conquest. Women in Texas and California worked with their families and in their communities to organize their communities, to represent their families. La mujer hispana, the Hispanic woman, has a long history of community service. When I first got elected in '81, one of the first reporters told me, what's happening that Mexican American women are now beginning to be involved in politics? And the answer is, Mexican American women, Hispanic women have been involved in this thing called politics as part of our history. What is politics, and what have these women been doing? Where is this pool that I'm talking about? Where is this pool right now? They are working in churches. They are working in schools. They are the mothers and sisters and aunts and cousins of some of you here who are Hispanics, some of you who are here studying. They are working in government. They are in the community, and they are leaders in the community. And we are very good leaders. Let me tell you why. We have an affinity that is the most powerful affinity with our community. When you are the mother and the sister and the wife of that familia, the power is incredible. We learned in Washington in October of this last year, when Mayor Cisneros convened the Hispanic agenda for '88, that one thing Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and Nicaraguenses, all of us had in common, and we could coalesce around, was the family. How is public policy going to affect the family? Because that's the most important component of any group, and particularly Hispanics. We look at the problems that we're experiencing right now. They are global problems. Maria's constituents have problems that are not Hispanic problems. Hispanics are not problems. We are not problems. We can be the solutions to problems if we're understood. The problems are housing, the way that our cities are growing with large numbers of minorities, be they Hispanic or Black or Asian, living in the urban centers, in the inner cities, and the cities sprawling. And the question is, what happens to those who stay behind? The second-class educational systems, the inability of our bright young people to get scholarships or assistance to go to the universities like these, the problems for child care, as more and more women are single, are mothers raising their own children by themselves, child care becomes very important. Health, our water, is our water clean? Energy, in San Antonio we own 28% of a nuclear plant that I have been fighting for 7 years. Gross inefficiency. Our problems in my district are Guatemaltecos and Hondureños and Salvadoreños that are there as refugees, and this country has not solved that problem either. One point I make is that these problems that we read about that are the problems of Hispanics are not the problems only of Hispanics. The problems that we have right now in large segments of our communities in this country are the problems of all people. Because if we don't solve those problems right now, if we don't educate those brown children right now, when you look at demographic trends of this country, you're going to find that the largest number of people, the largest growing number of people are brown people. And when we look into the year 2000 and see what the demography is going to look like when all of us here are old, 60, 70, 80, 90, because we're living longer, we're going to depend on those children that are in school right now to run this country and to keep it strong. So the issue is not an Hispanic issue. So I go back to where I started. It is important to focus on where the pool of leaders is, because they are there. But what we have to do is not only focus that it's there, and I'm talking about Latinas as a pool, because I don't think we talk about it enough. And it is a good pool to choose from. But we have to develop the eyes that value that leadership in the community. We have to develop the eyes that nurtures that, and that when someone like me, coming from this comunidad that I came from, gets into the public arena, that the next ones that come after me won't have to work so hard, because what we are is not valued and understood and appreciated and listened to. We connect real well with our community. And my big message to you that I wanted to give you as you analyze these issues and as you learn about them and write about them is look at this pool of leadership in this country that is Hispanic women, and how we're going to support it so that they can lead in a world that understands them. If not, we can make all the public policy in the world, but everything has to be the family and how it's going to affect the family. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman Berriozábal. Our final panelist has already been introduced to a great extent by Dean Allison, as well he deserves to be considering his list of achievements. I just wanted to add a couple that I have been able to dig up with the help of a fellow Neiman who's from the Miami Herald. Which, in spite of the fact of, I know, is not Mayor Suarez's favorite newspaper, any more than the LA Times is Mayor Tom Bradley's favorite newspaper in Los Angeles. Nevertheless, I think he will find them flattering, because this man has a very high regard for Mayor Suarez. I'll tell you his name later if you want to know, Javier. Mayor Suarez is now serving his second term as the mayor of Miami, Florida. He was re-elected last year with 63% of the vote, which any politician will tell you is pretty darn good. He's a native of Las Villas, Cuba, raised significantly, I think, in Washington, D.C., returned to Miami a few years ago after having attended Harvard, where he received his master's degree, as Dean Allison mentioned. Another thing I suspect he's fairly proud of, though, is the fact that he received his bachelor's degree in engineering from Villanova University a few years before that, which isn't all that easy. I mean, engineering degrees aren't that easy to come by, but especially not when you're a pretty good basketball player, as he is, and was, or I presume still is. There's Malkin Gym is right across if you want to try it. The reason I remember that, by the way, is because he was at Villanova in 1971 when my alma mater, UCLA, beat them in the NCAA finals. So, you know about that. Anyway, the distinguished mayor of Miami, Florida, Javier Suarez.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. We had planned a little basketball here with my former roommates. It just didn't work out. And, of course, it's just as well because it would have been very embarrassing to Flash Wiley, I think, to have to come out on the basketball court again. So many people around the room are so familiar to me. I'm happy to be back in these old haunting places and to be able to say something, although so many things that you have said have preempted what I could possibly say. I love the line about the fiesta politics. We've had a lot of presidential candidates come down to Miami lately, and they all try to say Viva Cuba Libre. And I wonder if they're talking about rum and cokes, you know. And we say, yes, Viva, Viva, we love rum and cokes, you know. Miami's own ethnicity is a very special character. Perhaps because we only have 3 basic ethnic groups, you know. In other cities, it seems like there's 20 or 40 or I don't know, so many identifiable groups. In Miami, it's always the 3, you know, the blacks, the Hispanics, and the Anglos. And it seems like, certainly as portrayed by the media, it seems like we're always at war. And of course, I don't believe that we are. But the fact that it's 3, somebody ought to do an analysis at the Kennedy School, Dean, as to why 3. It's, you know, it's so identifiable all the time, as opposed to you feel more natural if you have 15 or 20 different ethnic communities throughout the city. And it is a significant one and an interesting one because the 2 so-called minorities, which in the city of Miami make up 80% of the voting electorate, so much for minorities. The blacks are traditionally liberal in my city and Democrat, and the Cubans who make up 80% of our population of Hispanics, which now adds up to a whole city, 800,000 people, traditionally Republican and conservative, which is one good reason why I'm independent. But many people have tried to define us in the last year. Many books have been written about Miami, David Reef, T.D. Allman, Joan Didion, I don't know how many others. And the soul of Miami's Cuban Americans in particular sort of eludes everyone. Of the 3 books, I recommend only T.D. Allman's book, by the way, and it's a great book, Miami, the City of the Future. But we do have something that is, and now I'm speaking about myself as a Hispanic and within that as Cuban American. Yes, in foreign policy, definitely conservative. And if conservative means interventionist, the U.S. more active vis-a-vis what we consider to be freedom movements, freedom fighters. In fact, Frank, you'd be happy to know, or interested to know, that in Miami we always avoid saying that anyone is from the left. And when we introduce them, the MC, one way to get around it is to say, on my right, and then you introduce the people on the right, and then you say, on your right, and that's the rest of the group. Works out real well. But in domestic policies, and that's where the stereotypes come in, and the ones, of course, that I particularly resent and have been unfair to my community and my particular ethnic group, the idea that we're conservative in domestic policy is not at all the case. In fact, we don't have the tradition of laissez-faire. We don't have a tradition of the Supreme Court invalidating economic legislation to get a country out of the Depression. We don't have the feeling that the government should stay out of certain areas. We feel, and it's part of our tradition, the government should get into whatever areas are necessary to guarantee fundamental human rights, and we understand that to include a decent standard of living, which is one of the reasons why I made it a part of my platform in 1979, 81, 83, 85, and 87. It took me a while to get elected. But why I made it a part of my platform to create and build affordable housing in the city of Miami, while my opponents were saying, well, it's not really a traditional municipal concern. The county is the one receiving the federal HUD funds. In fact, they are the agency and the entity that is designated to receive HUD funds. And I said, no, but the city of Miami can also do it. If we'll find money someplace, we'll get them from community development block grants, we'll get them from concessions that we'll extract from developers. I finally, when I had just elected, I proposed a linkage ordinance in the city of Miami. And my legal staff told me that it was illegal, unconstitutional, immoral, and improper. And until I found the one that you have here. And I used the Massachusetts ordinance or statute as a defense to my proposal. And my supposedly more liberal opponents were saying, again, to keep the city out of those endeavors. And it didn't work out for them. And it did not get elected, in addition to the fact that they were a lot shorter. But we won't get into that today. Actually, I have a line about that. You know, my opponent in the runoff in 1985 was a very fine Cuban-American banker who spent $1.2 million to try to defeat me. And we had stand-up podiums like this, and he was very short. And at the end of my presentation, if I went before, I would raise the mic so that he would have to bring it all the way down. That's not true, but it's a great story. He just sent me a set of china for City Hall because last time he came to visit me, we had coffee in styrofoam cups. But someone characterized on Spanish radio the other day, one of the supposedly most conservative radio commentators said, you know, we Cubans are very much in favor of Reagan in foreign policy matters, and we're very much like Martin Luther King in domestic policy matters. And that anybody would even combine those two figures might seem quite interesting to you, but I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and we, of course, again, want to emphasize that we avoid the stereotypes. Our city had a lot of what you talked about, Willie. We had a lot of what you mentioned was interesting, was important to do, which is we had Hispanics elected to public office, we had Cubans elected to public office who weren't very good people in government. And maybe because Cubans are very self-confident people, I don't know what it is, but we just threw the bums out. In fact, I was involved in throwing out as many as 3 already, and one mayor who was not Cuban but was Hispanic, and no qualms about the fact that they were Hispanic. One of them, I have to tell you one story about it. I was involved in a runoff in 1971. I lost that in 1981 rather, against a fellow whose name is Demetrio Perez, and I was still trying to feel my way around Miami politics and Miami's particularly Hispanic politics, and I had a debate against him in Spanish radio, and the moderator said, Mr. Perez, would you explain what you would do about the solid waste department of the city of Miami? And he said, yes, I will do that in a second. He was answering in Spanish. He said, however, before I do that, I have to say something about my opponent. I want to tell you that he went to a very liberal university. He went to Harvard, and he went on and on about Harvard. And I was sitting there trying to figure out how to get around that. So when it was my turn, he asked me about the solid waste department. I said, I'm going to get to that, but before I have to answer my opponent's remark about Harvard and say that if he was admitted tomorrow to take a course in advanced dominoes at Harvard, well, he'd get on the plane, he'd get on a rocket and go up there. And I thought I won that, So I was feeling really good, and he didn't even wait till my answer was complete. He said, well, there you have it. There you have it. He made fun of what is practically the Cuban national game, dominoes. Next he'll make fun of the palm tree, and he'll make fun of cigars and guayaberas and everything that we hold dear, and I didn't know. I had no comeback. I lost that election by 0.6%. I asked for a recount, and they denied it. But in '85, I was finally in a runoff in a mayoral race in which we had many, many debates. I think I probably talked about that the last time I was here. I think Miami, it does as much, the media does as much to highlight what the candidates have to offer as any city, which makes it easier for somebody with less money. And that helped me out a great deal. We had many debates. We had them in 2 languages. In fact, in my '85 runoff, I called my headquarters at some point. I said, when are the debates? We have a 1-week runoff in Miami between the primary and the runoff between the 2 top candidates. They're nonpartisan elections. And finally, from the headquarters, they said, you'll be very happy to hear that on Saturday night, you're on the air on Channel 10 live. That's one of the network stations. On Sunday night, you're on the air live on Channel 7. On Monday, you're on the air live on Channel 4. Channel 23 for an hour and Channel 51 for an hour. Those last two are in Spanish, plus Channel 6, 1 hour taped, and about 15 radio debates, all in 3 days. And that helped a great deal. But in that 85 debate, my opponent was also a Cuban American, the first time. By the way, also independent. So either one that would have won, it would have been a first for Miami, an independent mayor and a Cuban American mayor. And in Hispanic precincts, when it was all said and done, I had won in some areas as high as 85% of the vote. And I sat around trying to understand how I could get 85% against a Cuban American and against Maurice Frey, a Puerto Rican born, not Cuban American, in same districts. I would not get anywhere near that much. And even this year, when I beat Frey again, keeps coming back from the past, I didn't do nearly as well. What was it that would explain to me about the voters and the voting patterns of the people in those communities that would not accept the Raúl Masvidal and that would accept me and actually did better, Maurice Frey did better among Cuban voters there. And I finally concluded, Maria, that it was what I call the family vote. The family vote is an interesting phenomenon. The grandparent identifies with Xavier Suarez. I don't know that I can explain it to you. They all think I'm their grandson, and I maintain that image. I tell them that we are related way back, that I'm from... There's 6 provinces in Cuba, and I've convinced everybody I'm all from all 6 of them, and it works out real well. And then the younger crowd, for reasons like basketball, and just because I'm younger, obviously, than the opponents typically. So they identify with me. And the middle-aged group, that's the tough one for me. And against Raúl Masvidal, it was particularly tough. He was middle-aged. He had a pretty thick accent when he spoke the English language, etc. And he was balding, all the other things. And what I finally concluded is the grandparents and the young kids who live together, because the households are very large. Miami's household income for Hispanics is now just about in excess of what it is for the Anglo community. Of course, the households are a lot larger. You wouldn't believe how many people live in them. But they communicate with each other, and they want to vote as a block. An interesting phenomenon. And the young people and the grandparents convince the middle-aged ones, we want to vote for Suarez. We like Xavier. Actually, I almost always go by the first name. It's almost always Javier. And whichever way, they convince each other, and they want to vote as a block. It's just no one wants to say, well, I'm going to vote differently. I like Masvidal. He's, I identify with him more. They want to vote as a block. It's the family vote. It's an interesting phenomenon. And, in fact, that leads me to, and I don't know how I'm doing on time. I didn't have one of those nice little notes that says 5 minutes, but I'm just told 1 minute. Leads me to what really is a more profound definition of what we're all about, and that is, in fact, in what our ethnicity is all about, and that's already been defined, really, by Maria. It is the clear understanding of how we want to preserve certain values, and of which the single most important one is in fact the family. I could say many things about that, and obviously that would be a whole topic for another discussion. I do want to say something about the upcoming election, because I was asked to mention something about the presidency. One of the visions that I had that scared me about one of the candidates for president that I was at one point considering endorsing, and it's not your candidate. Well, this is one that I didn't endorse. Was that at some point, even though the fellow expressed a great deal of interest in me, he came to my office, and he certainly had he was a viable candidate. He's still a viable candidate. That already says something with all the carnage that we've had in this election. But I kept thinking, at some point after the election, I'm going to call the White House, and I'm going to say, this is the mayor of Miami. I'd like to speak to the president, this and that. And that they were going to say, the guy was going to say, yeah, I remember that guy. There was a mayor down there in Miami someplace in South Florida, and I don't remember his name exactly, and I certainly can't pronounce it, but kind of, he kind of knew something about some things. Not the dumbest guy in the world. And that it would be just a difficult problem of recall and of affinity. I think that the presidential candidate that is going to win this election, and I'll be flat out and say it, is going to have to show some affinity to the Hispanic culture and to the Hispanic community throughout the United States. Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Mexicans, the 3 principal groups. We may differ on some other things, but the cultural affinity, the fact that the Spanish is important to us, the fact that we don't want to give up on it. In Miami, of course, we have a critical mass. We have 800,000 people that speak the language, and A lot of people complain about the fact that we speak it too often in places like crowded elevators and so on, the usual stories. And it's true, and we can improve and all of that. Although, by the way, I want to tell you that a survey that was done of Miamians by Tropic Magazine, the Miami Herald, very fine Miami Herald insert. I say that for the Neiman fellow. No, actually it is, and I very much enjoy that publication. That 98% of the Cuban Americans or Hispanic Americans in Dade County wanted their kids to speak perfect English, and only 94% of non-Hispanics. It was an interesting statistic, and we have a certain reverence for the language and so on. But I do think the presidential candidate is going to prevail, because if you look at the key states in this election, they are going to be California and Texas and Florida, have large Hispanic populations. A lot of times not represented numerically by the number of citizens or residents. We have the same problem, Harry, of lack of registration. We have one problem that affects us. It's just a lot of people are not legal, and their statuses are not able to be made into legal status to vote. Some others just don't want to serve on juries, etc. But those three key states are, those three states are going to be key in the general election. They're going to be probably a little less key in the primary, because the Hispanics are basically in one party. And I do want to add that the approach has been bipartisan. As opposed to the black leadership, there's a lot of talk among Hispanic leaders, and I know Henry feels very strongly about this, to try to keep a bipartisan approach. And I think it's going to be key to the election, the Hispanic vote. I believe in that sense that if, for example, it was a Bush versus Gephardt race, I think that Gephardt would be in a great deal of trouble in Hispanic areas. I really believe that. I think the Republican candidate there would have a great opportunity. Bush obviously has a lot going for him in the Hispanic area. His son Jeb is absolutely fluent in Spanish, and his grandchildren by Jeb were born speaking Spanish initially. Smart kids actually were born speaking Spanish already. No, they picked it up, but if the election were, for example, between your candidate and a Bush or anyone else, I think that there you'd see some problems for the Republican candidate. Dukakis' fluency in Spanish is known. I am sure he will figure out a way to make it even more known in the upcoming months. And I think that you might find that among those three states, that decision will be made as to the next president of the United States, and anyone who doesn't show that affinity some way or another for Hispanic culture, for the Hispanic language, for the right of people to speak another language and to maintain it culturally in a city and in a metropolitan area and in the country as a whole, is going to be a deciding factor in the next presidential election. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Suarez. As is the tradition in these Kennedy School forums now, we move to a question and answer period where you will, as all members of the audience, will be allowed to ask questions of our panelists. You will note that there are two microphones, one in each aisle here, so I'm going to ask that you just line up, queue up for all the Brits here at the microphones, and I will acknowledge you as one by one, and you can ask your questions, direct them to whatever member of the panel you like, and I will take my seat here again. If there's anyone at this microphone that I can't see, please wave or don't shout, but I think I will pay attention. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I have a question for mainly the elected officials who are on the panel. And my question is, particularly in an election year, there is a great scrambling for power, and has been expressed here, Hispanics have a greater amount of power than they have in the past. And my question focuses around how various groups that have traditionally not been in power, in this case I'll be speaking specifically about racial minorities, are able to form coalitions and avoid competition so as to cooperate in their rise to greater power and greater access to resources. And we know that in Boston, the Irish did not get ahead by giving anything to anyone else. And I'm wondering how Hispanic leaders now who have power and are thinking about increasing that power plan to make coalitions, particularly with the black community. And in an election year, there's a big challenge in that, particularly with the Jackson campaign, which has a specific ideology which is based on cooperation among traditionally oppressed peoples.
I'm going to address it as it pertains to real-life situations in my city, in San Antonio. Prior to 1975, we had a city that was run by a group called the Good Government League. At that time, we used to elect our council members at large, and virtually had no representation at the city council that came from the community, from Black or Mexican Americans. In 1975, a very well-organized group of largely Hispanics got together using Saul Alinsky type organizing methods, and based on on churches in the city, they became a very viable community grassroots organization, coalescing around issues that were important to the community. That gave to the city, that gave us in the city a tension that had never been present before. Before, the city's politics pretty much had been dictated by a power structure, very old families and pretty white. When that tension came from the Hispanic community, there began to be a dialogue. People had to sit at the table and include the Black community. Like in Miami, we have what we call Anglo, Mexican American, and Black, and have people sit around the table and achieve a consensus before we move on bigger issues. So I think one of the ways is done to coalesce around issues that touch everybody, that are generic, that are not any color. Issues having to do with economic growth, with jobs, with good jobs, with drainage, with fire stations, and so on. That's just one example of how a coalition can be built, and it's a very good case study and a very good model in San Antonio.
One way to do it, and that's important, I think your question is key, because in coalitions is power in so many ways. And for example, my decision to back a presidential candidate, I consulted leaders of other minorities and brought them into that decision making. They may not have been their first choice, but the fact that they were consulted was a very important thing to them. In the area of affirmative action, you find that minorities tend to coalesce if they otherwise don't believe very much in affirmative action, when they see that there are governmental contracts, procurement, etc., to be obtained. And in Miami, I try not to stress it too much, but mathematically, the formula we use is 25-25 Black and Hispanic. When we go to women, it's 17-17 and 17. But the proportion of our population that is Hispanic, of our residents, as opposed to registered voters, always make that distinction because of the low percentage of registered voters as opposed to residents. But the percentage of residents that are Hispanic is over 60 in the city and 25% Black, and yet the formulas are 25-25. So there's some piggybacking going on, and we don't always speak about it a heck of a lot because some of these programs are meant to resolve inequities of the past where Hispanics were not nearly as much discriminated against, particularly Cubans who've only been around for 30 years to be discriminated against, and for which there really hasn't been all that much discrimination in some cases because of the critical mass that I mentioned, the self-contained economy. So those things help out a lot. The fact that on issues we can come to an agreement, and I might add that just as an example, the Rouse Company, which has built so many projects in different parts of the country, had never done more than 15% minority participation and ownership of the businesses. In Miami, they have 51%.
First, I'd like to commend all the panel members, in particular Councilwoman Berio Soval and Willie Velasquez. My question is going to focus on what Willie Velasquez and Councilwoman spoke about, and that's conditions. For example, the conditions that Hispanos and Blacks face in the United States in terms of unemployment are worsening since the 60s. Our unemployment rate is double that of Anglos. Our Latino and Black children are dropping out of high school faster than any other group. Housing conditions are worsening. So the point is, the conditions have decreased rather than improved. Alongside, elected officials of both groups have increased. My question is, to what extent do you really believe elected officials can make a difference in addressing the conditions that I just mentioned when they have steadily worsened?
Yeah, I think there's some extenuating circumstances, though. The first one, there's a series, I think, of about 2 or 3. A good number of the Latinos in the country live in the Southwest. And not only are they affected first and more severely in a recession, but in the Southwest, particularly in Texas and New Mexico, you had a more than normally severe recession. The results, for example, of long-term unemployment at the rate of 25 and 26% in counties like Hidalgo County in South Texas are severe. Those effects are severe. After a long-term boom, we had so you had a recession, then you had the peso devaluation, then you had the freeze of crops, and then the recession lasted a long time. That combination of things resulted in actually increasing the number of Hispanics in poverty. In 1979, 21% of the Hispanics were in poverty. In 1986, 7 years later, it increased to 27%. Actually, if it keeps going the way it's going, we're going to surpass the blacks, which is at 31.1% poverty. Those things happen, I feel, regardless of who you have in office. The transfer of government programs designed to aid people to the states resulted in actually less being spent. The cutbacks from 81 to 83 on a wide range of programs added to that. And then since 83, they didn't keep up with population growth, nor did they keep up with inflation. It resulted in actual decreases in the amount of money available to help these people. So as a result, you've got what the Congressional Budget Office, I think was it last week, said that you have higher incomes, and the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. I am not sure that the school board down there could have done much in some of those towns. I'm not sure that that the city council in some of those areas, the county in some of those areas could have done much. But I'm going to tell you this. The main reason that they're increasing their registration and turnout is because they won at the local level. Is because you don't have a guy like A.B. Nail anymore, sheriff of Pecos. He's got a very small jail, and 4 people died in that jail. And he used to shave the Mexicans' heads because they were dirty and sprinkle them with powder to get rid of the fleas, right? That's why 4 people got died. Well, they don't have him anymore. Maybe the unemployment's a little higher. But they kicked him out. And the Chicano box gave the Raul Ortiz 379 to 1 votes. See? A.B. Nail got 1 vote. I think that the criteria for whether it's successful or not is not just the national criteria. It also has to be that the local superintendent is now Mexican, and we got Mexican sheriff sometimes, and they hire Mexicans as police, and those kinds of things are also important because the school board can't do anything about high sustained unemployment.
I was going to say pretty much the same thing also. I got elected 8 months after Ronald Reagan got elected. And when I went to my first national meeting of the National League of Cities, I was told that with that administration, we were going to have more responsibility at the local level. It was called a new federalism, I think. We were going to have more discretion to take care of our problems locally. And then money that we had gotten used to started getting frozen. And we who have been the elected officials in these years, as Willie has been said, we are the ones that have to look people in the eye and decide either to raise taxes locally or reduce programs. What happens is that my constituents and I are together in this. It's not them demanding or saying certain things and me doing something else. The issue is we're together. I mean, we've got it together. We cannot do it by ourselves at the local level when you're talking about 70% reduction in housing subsidies that we had gotten dependent on. We are right now, we've got our thinking caps on. And everybody, it seems that everybody, even Better Homes and Gardens, is talking about housing now, and we're trying to figure out how can we make it at the local level and not depend so much on the federal government, because I happen to believe that as much as I think I'm a Democrat and I'm supporting Michael Dukakis, and he's real big on housing, and that's one of the things I'm impressed about what he did in this state. But I don't have a hope that we're going to have to just forego completely a partnership between the local level and our states and our business community also. We're going to have to develop some ways to solve our own problems locally. That's what we're trying to do right now, but we can't do it all at the local level.
Yes.
Hi, my question is one, I guess, for all of the panelists on the kind of the general issue of racism in the United States and the anomaly that at this time, as it's been mentioned, there's been great strides made. To what extent, I guess, is open to controversy in the numbers of Latino elected officials in the United States, has also seen the rise of movements like U.S. English only type movements, not only in Southwest but also in the Miami area. And my question for each of the panelists is, do the appearance of more elected officials appears not to really have affected a lot of the underlying stereotypes which are used against our communities and which continue to keep people down. And you often hear that the most successful politicians are ones who are being counseled by their advisors. And again, I'm not sure how true this is. Perhaps that's something that the elected officials on the panel can address from their personal experience, have been counseled to appear to try to appease some of the nativist sentiments that are coming out. Don't be too Latino. Don't come out too strong because you're going to scare people. How do you feel that you can reconcile those two? Are we going to have more people in elective office, but then those will be the same pressures be put upon them to back off from these issues, which are very real, the major issue of racism?
Harry, go ahead first.
Let me just address the first part of your question. It is true that there has been an increase from, like Willie mentioned, from 1,500 to 3,000 in the Southwest. However, if you add up all the black and Hispanic elected officials in the United States, they still constitute less than 2% of all elected officials nationwide. So while we've had dramatic increases, our elected officials, at least from the perspective we see in Washington, are often faced in minority situations where there are 1, 2, or 3 votes of a small minority. So sometimes, yes, we've had progress of elected officials, but they still face the fact that they are representatives of a minority group. And what does minority mean is that your public policy or the issues that you address may not get the saliency, may not pass through when those officials articulate them. I'll let the second part of the question be answered by the other panelists.
Willie, you want to?
Oh, I think it's very clear. I'm not sure if it's a healthy sign or not, but I'm going to tell you this: that before in West Texas, when the registration was 18 and 20%, 21%, no Mexican ever got elected, no Mexican ever came out, and everybody was nice and happy. No English only, none of this stuff. Then the Mexicans started registering, they started winning. Then you started getting a lot of acrimony, a lot of fighting, and English only came out, anti-immigration, anti-bilingual, polarized voting, it's us and them. I feel that it's a reaction to the growing strength of the Hispanics in this country. At the local level, I think you feel it a lot closer. But it's a reaction that has happened many times. And in a way, it sort of toughens you to be able to get in position to govern down the line. I don't know if there's anything anybody can do about a transfer of power. Some of these people have been in power a long time, and they object to getting to now having to count the votes right and to draw the districts according to the law, and wind up losing, and they get angry and mad about it, and it becomes acrimonious, and they start up all these other crazy things. I think that is something that is going to happen. In a way, it is a sign that that large group of people is moving, and a large group of people is objecting to that movement. Because in the past, They were really quiet. Nobody complained about anything, and there was no problem, right? Now that the Mexicans are winning, there's all kinds of problems. But in the areas where they won the first, it's starting to sort of die down. It's starting to sort of. So I say this recurs occasionally in American history. It's occurring now because it's the Hispanics that are immigrating to this country, and I think it'll eventually die out. But that's something almost inevitable.
Councilwoman or Mayor, would you?
I really, that's a hard question. I really don't know how to respond to it. I don't know how you solve that problem. What I do know is that I know what you're talking about. There was an article in a newspaper magazine article done about me about a year ago, 8-9 months ago, and the big problem that this particular young man writer saw in me was that I was too pro-Hispanic, and I haven't been able to figure out exactly what that means because, housing and streets and drainage and neighborhood development and downtown development and linkage fees, and I mean, to me, that, as I indicated before, pretty generic issues. I don't know what to do about it except that maybe it's a blessing in disguise because when those things come along and when opposition comes and you get to see it, you get to know when somebody is saying or doing something as a reaction to you personally and not a philosophical issue difference. What happens is that you develop a lot thicker skin, and I've developed very thick skin, and that's real good. And the other one is to stick to the issues. People are about issues, and I represent a district, and I find, and it's not all Mexican American. My district is about 79% Mexican American and 4% black, and then the rest is Anglo. And my support comes from all over. In fact, the leadership in my district is mostly Anglo because they're senior citizen Anglo who live in the inner city and young people Anglos who are moving back. And that's my strongest pool of workers. I get support from across the board, and I find that whether it's downtown or in the neighborhoods, everybody wants the same thing. And as long as we kind of stick to the issues, what do people want for their tax money? People want fairness, they want a good street, they want to feel safe, they want the fire to be put out, and stick to the issues and know them well.
Here's one.
There may be an element of the fact that as Hispanics are rising in the political arena, it is not a particularly good time for politicians in terms of people's estimations. I haven't seen those ratings lately of how people feel about politicians, but if I remember correctly, and by the way, other than people in the media who are themselves going down and down in those polls.
You're telling me.
But And I've said some positive things tonight about the Miami Herald, at least the Sunday insert, but I have to tell you one thing that illustrates a very negative thing about what the Herald did a couple of weeks ago. They did a poll of 100 people to determine who had power in Dade County. It was a poll of the elite, where the elite were asked if they were the elite, and they concluded that they were. And the poll of the business activists and the movers and shakers was bad enough. 18 people were said to be the movers and shakers in the private sector, of which 3 happened to be from the organization that did the poll, or its parent company, which is bad enough. But they happened to do one that really hurts in this area, because it was, they just sort of threw out, they didn't explain the methodology at all, and they disclaimed any significance to it or any validity to it. They threw out a list of 5 people that they said in the government sector that were people that got things done in Miami. And of the 5, there were 3 congressmen, and with all due respect, they're fine people. They're all quite old. Congressman Pepper, Dante Fasell, and Bill Lehman, and 2 other public officials who happened to be Hispanic. It happens that one of them was the county manager who just had to resign under an incredible number of clouds. It's not even one, it's just quite a few of them, and had recently been indicted. And the other one is the mayor of a city called Hialeah that you probably haven't heard about. And I think he's been a good administrator, but he's also had a lot of problems in the media and investigations and so on. And my answer to that is, you know, it's very difficult for me to be a role model for Hispanics or non-Hispanics if a newspaper finds that I'm not one of the 5 most important people in the community in terms of the government as mayor of the principal city. And why? My only question is, I don't take any issue with the people that they polled in that poll. Why don't they, if you're going to do something like that, why don't they poll the entire area? I mean, want to do something scientific, in which case I have no doubt, you know, that where I'll stand. And I'd make an effort to try to be a role model to the community and to try to put the name of a Hispanic elected official as high as I can. But none of the other ones that are having an impact, none of the Ileana Ross, as a state senator, or Nilda Gonzalez Quevedo, or some of the other Hispanic elected officials, Lincoln Diaz-Balart, you know, were at all even mentioned. And it's just very frustrating that the people are not in any way given an indication that they should look up to elected officials, and as a result, you have a lot of hostility by the native population that maybe resents what they see as some of the people who they're being told this is your classic Hispanic leader, and who I don't really think is particularly representative at all.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Earlier, Councilwoman Berio Zaval, if I said your last name correctly, alluded to a project where Mayor Henry Cisneros helped form a coalition comprised of Hispanic elected officials and Hispanic advocacy groups, where they helped produce a Hispanic political agenda for the '88 presidential campaign, if I'm correct. My question concerns this one Hispanic political agenda. Can we, as Hispanic electorate, afford more than one political agenda? That is, are we too politically underrepresented at times, politically disempowered in certain counties, to have, say, Cubanos supporting intervention in Nicaragua and Latinos in the Southwest not? Or can we afford power struggles like we saw last year in an election in Los Angeles, an election which pitted Assemblywoman Gloria Molina against school board member Larry Gonzalez? So my question concerns, it's a twofold question. One, can we have one political agenda? And two, can we afford power struggles within the Latino electorate?
I don't think we can afford power struggles. Maybe that's some of the problem, and we would do a lot better if we got along better. In that situation in California between an Hispanic male and an Hispanic female, we could have a whole forum on that. But the Hispanic agenda that we worked on, voted, and accepted in Washington was a very good process. It was the first time that this had ever happened. This was the first time that the different groups of Hispanos had come together. And what the leadership tried to do is see how many issues can we agree on. We're a diversified group. Not all Hispanos are the same. You know, we're talking about people coming from different backgrounds, even within our community. So I think the task there was to see how many things can we agree on, and then let's get together on those first. And I think that's significant. That's we need that. One. Number two, the other is very bad.
When I was offered the position of Naleo, and I told an academic friend of mine that I was going to be directing an organization that represented Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans, he said, good luck, you'll have nothing to do for the next couple of months. And it turns out that Naleo has addressed some issues simply because what we do is, and I'm referring back to what Maria said, is we address issues. We find that Cuban Americans and Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans are all concerned about the lack of government procurements with Hispanic businesses. They're all concerned about citizenship. When somebody makes a disparaging, racist remark, who is an appointee in the federal administration, it doesn't matter if that Hispanic is a Republican or that Hispanic is a Democrat. They're going to say that racism is wrong. So you coalesce on issues, and you leave the issues like the future status of Puerto Rico, the Nicaragua situation. Those are issues that you say we're going to disagree on them. So it just depends on what your values and norms are, whether or not you think that this is a basis of coalition, or because we can't agree on everything, that's not a coalition.
Mayor Suarez.
I just want to give one illustration of what was just mentioned by Harry. In the 1986 U.S. senatorial race in the state of Florida, a candidate who was the incumbent made a disparaging remark about Mexicans or Mexican Americans, and it was deadly, devastating for her with the Hispanic electorate, even though most of the electorate was Cubans and otherwise liked some of her viewpoints in foreign policy and so on. And I just want to say one other thing, that when I was elected, right away I was invited to address the Hispanic caucus in Washington, D.C. It was a gesture made by non-Cuban elected officials, Hispanics, who were mostly Mexicans and I guess a couple of Puerto Ricans. And then I was invited to Naleo and in L.A., and then I was invited to San Diego by the Hispanic community who were mostly Mexicans and welcomed me in a very special way. And we've been trying to emphasize the things that unite us as opposed to the things that divide us. I think it would be a mistake to totally ignore disagreements on ideology, because you can't ignore certain things. But it's it's a classic case of, as I hear from non-Cuban Hispanics, of why do you want to talk about communism all the time? And I say, let me talk about communism for 5 minutes, and we'll get on to the rest of the agenda. And in my particular case, I don't necessarily function that way, but I know with a lot of my fellow Cuban Americans from Miami, you just give them the first 5 minutes, and you say, gee, I agree with you, this is a tragic problem, we got to do something about it. Now let's talk about a domestic agenda, then you spend the next 2 hours talking about a domestic agenda and find out that you agree on 95% of all the issues.
I've been informed, I'm sorry to say, we have a lot of people waiting to ask questions, that we can only take one more because we do have a time limit on how long we can use the forum here, so I will take one more. But before we do, I have a couple of announcements to make, including the fact that those of you who will not get your questions asked here will have an opportunity to do so upstairs after we are done. There will be a reception up on the 3rd floor in the Feinsod room, and all are welcome to attend. So those of you who do not get a chance to ask your question, in the meantime, I'll let this young gentleman ask the last.
Hello. This question is addressed to Xavier Suarez, Mayor of Casablanca. Do you think that...
it was Camelot.
Camelot. Although Hispanic politicians have enjoyed considerable success in getting elected to local offices in Florida, they seem to have enjoyed scant success to getting elected to Congress over the last decade. Do you perceive a change? Do you think that national politics holds a brighter future for Latino politicians in Florida? And if so, do you think that this will be because Latino communities are expanding, as in your case, northward from Dade County into Broward and Palm Beach counties? Or do you think that maybe the recent gubernatorial elections in which Martinez was elected reveals that perhaps Anglos are willing to look beyond ethnic lines?
Yeah, that's a mouthful of a question. It will take a while to answer. It turns out that before I went to Miami, according to Sue Irvin, who was in class with me at the MPP program, I had always expected to run for Congress and to be mayor of Miami. Apparently, I was telling everybody that in my first year in MPP. Actually, I went to Miami with the idea of being a congressman someday, and I have totally discarded that for the simple reason that being mayor of Miami is a lot more fun than being a congressman, and probably can wield more influence in many ways. But we do have up-and-coming people, and I will want to have a great deal to say about who will be the first Hispanic congressman elected from the district now held by Claude Pepper, for example, which is rapidly becoming high percentage Hispanic, and the one held by Danny Fasel. The principal Cuban American groups in Miami are supporting the re-election of Claude Pepper and Danny Fasel. So it's not a situation where everybody's sort of joining together to get one of ours in or anything like that. We're looking at performance, ideology, position in the U.S. Congress, influence to be wielded, etc. The election of the governor with the last name Martinez at the moment of the election was definitely a plus for anyone who has a last name like that. I don't know what they do with someone like Maria's last name, which is Basque and that much more complicated. But even the fact that people in Florida were willing to vote for somebody named Martinez was definitely a positive thing in terms of statewide aspirations for Hispanics. Whether subsequently to the election, the tenure of the present governor has been helpful to Hispanics aspiring to statewide office is another issue. And I don't even have to tell you, if you're from Florida, you know what I'm talking about. But and that's going to be a factor, frankly, if he doesn't do something drastic in the next 2.5 years to improve his performance. That's going to affect the future of Hispanics statewide, I think, as people will say, the guy's name is Martinez, whether he was born in Tampa and speaks English with a southern accent or whatever you want to call it. And it is my hope that he will make some drastic changes, and I have so indicated to him, because it will affect how things will go in the future on a statewide basis. The one thing that I did mention that is very important in Miami politics among Hispanics is money. There's plenty there, as opposed to maybe some other parts of the country among Hispanics, and there's plenty to spend in politics. I mean, the Cuban American National Foundation as a lobbying organization, I think they were third in the state of Florida as a PAC in terms of contributions, and many contribute to local and state and national races. So that resource, which is important because of media and because of the need to distribute your views and everything else, is already one that we're quite advanced in Miami.
Okay. I've been asked also to mention that the Journal of Hispanic Policy, which co-sponsored this event tonight, is still accepting submissions for its next issue. The deadline, that's an important word for somebody like me, is March the 21st. So if anyone is interested in having something published, I'm sure Kim Flores and the other editors of the journal would be glad to hear from you. As I mentioned earlier, there is now a reception upstairs on the 3rd floor in the Fine Side room. If you will please join us there, I'm sure we would all appreciate it. Thank you for your attention.